Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of the cEDH cast. Today, we're going to be discussing one of the most powerful cards in the history of Magic. But first, I'm going to be introducing a good friend, Rebel. Hello, Rebel.
Hey guys.
So, today, Rebel and I are going to be discussing Mana Crypt. Now, one of the most interesting things about, cards that reach a certain power level is they often have, they're so powerful that they do, many things at once. And when I asked you, I think I asked you what is Mana Crypt, or why is Mana Crypt so good, and do you want to say the answer that you gave?
Yeah, it's a 2 colorless ritual.
Yeah, so if you, this is just me personally. When I hear about, when I think of Mana Crypt, I think of it as like a ramp spell, right? So,
Right.
you play it and you get 2 more mana for the rest of the game. But in reality, and in cEDH often, it is just a ritual, right? I play my ad nauseam, I go down to 3 life, I play my Mana Crypt, cast Final Fortune and die. But, sometimes you resolve ad nauseam, you hit Mana Crypt, you play Mana Crypt, tap it for 2 mana, you play a Mana Vault, all of a sudden you're just popping off rituals and making tons of mana and probably winning the game. So, that's kind of interesting, right? That Mana Crypt kind of, on top of just being a 0 mana rock that taps for 2 mana, it's also this 0 mana ritual that produces 2 mana, which is actually kind of insane because often there's cards like talismans and signets and other things that you can immediately use that mana to turn it into, colored mana, which is super powerful, right?
Yeah, I think when most people think about Mana Crypt, it's like what you were saying, right? Like it's a sort it's like a free source of 2 colorless each of your turns, which is very strong on its own. But I think with how fast a format like cEDH is, timing is like really important. So I think to me the when Mana Crypt is like super powerful is when you can do like turn 1 land, Mana Crypt into Talisman, and that Talisman's gonna give you colored mana. And that like continues the chain, or like you can go turn 1 land, Mana Crypt, Rhystic Study, and then as you mentioned earlier, like Mana Crypt super important after you like ad naus. So if you like play a lot of ad naus decks, like colored mana comes at a premium. Like you really need colored mana, and usually if you do like a main phase ad naus, like you might not have enough colored mana afterwards. So you really need to hit that Mana Crypt into like a vault, or like let's say Mana Crypt into like talisman, so you can spirit guide and like double red for your final fortune. I think those aspects are like super important.
Yeah. So, I think the card is so powerful that a lot of the times there are certain decks that are almost built around mulliganing until you hit a card like it, right? So you can't play 5 copies of Mana Crypt in your deck, but in Najeela, you're definitely trying to find a way to have 3 mana as early as possible, right? So you're playing all your dorks that are kind of it's almost like every dork is a bad impersonation of Soul Ring, and every
Yeah,
Soul Ring is a bad impersonation of Mana Crypt, right?
yeah, I was just thinking that actually, like, about other rocks you would have, and just how much worse Soul Ring is, compared to Mana Crypt, just because the cost is 0 versus 1.
Yeah, I'd say the only card in the format right now that really rivals Mana Crypt in terms of its ability to be explosive is probably Jewel Lotus, right?
Yeah, and there's like so many discussions about, um, there's like a tendency to really want to compare Jewel Lotus to like Mana Crypt, and I think, um, as I was mentioning earlier, like we are talking about it as like a ritual, right? And like about how these things are like kind of um, tools that are really important in like the timing of your play. And when you compare like Jewel Lotus to Mana Crypt, a lot of people compare it in the aspect of Mana Crypt is a permanent thing that gives you 2 mana like each turn, but Jewel Lotus, like for the decks that can really use it, gives you 1 more than Mana Crypt, and also it's colored mana, and also it costs for nothing. So I think that's the part you should be comparing. Like you would like in a Godo deck, they're both kind of the same thing.
Yeah, that if your deck is constructed, and we can kind of go into this too about Mana Crypt, but in terms of Jeweled Lotus, if your deck is constructed in such a way that three colored mana, 3 colored mana of any one color that can only cast commander spells, if that's a strong enough ritual in your deck, then it's a strong enough ritual, right? And in the same way, if a 0 mana ritual that makes 2 colorless is good enough in your deck, it's good enough for your deck. Now, I know you've played a lot of cEDH, and you were telling me earlier that cEDH actually isn't the best deck for cards like Mana Crypt because of the color requirements and the activated ability. Do you want to go into that a bit?
Yeah. So I think earlier versions of my cEDH decks, I had Mana Crypt in there just because, it's Mana Crypt. I can always go land Mana Crypt cEDH. But back then, I play a lot more like dorks, and because cEDH has that unique need for different color identities in the permanents you have, oftentimes those permanents have just colored like mana costs. So, like for example, Sig is like blue black, blue black. Derevi is just 3 of each one color. So, I mean, Silvala, if you play Silvala, is like green, green, and one colorless, right? Like a lot of these cards don't use that colorless. Like your interaction, maybe Mana Drain or like Dispel, Dovin's Veto. Maybe if you play Fire Company, use that one. But you see what I'm getting at. Like a lot of these spells we use in cEDH actually don't really use that colorless pip. So while I still play Mana Crypt, I actually didn't play Mana Vault, and I didn't play Soaring in like the earlier renditions. And then I really thought about like how can I use like those. We can agree like those rocks are like some of the best things you can have in your deck, right? Like Mana Vault, Soaring, and Mana Crypt. How can I build a deck that can leverage those cards better, as opposed to having cards that doesn't allow me to maximize on those effects? So like switching the dorks for like talismans, I think is like something I did. I actually learned a lot about this, or like really started thinking about this when I read. I forgot who. I think it's Deeks. I forgot whose primer it was for Niv Mizzet, like the Parun, and how that deck was really designed to like really leverage the colorless pips in the spells because your commander costs so much in colored pips. So I forgot what that pirate like spell was, the one that's like deal 2 damage to each non-pirate.
Yeah, I know exactly the one you're talking about. It's like a
But
pyroclasm, but doesn't use
yeah,
pirates.
so it was a thing that really interested me, or was really interesting to me in that primer. Was like normally if you think pyroclasm versus like that spell, pyroclasm better, right? Because it costs 2 colorless. But if all your spells cost colored pips and your Mana Crypt makes 2 colorless, they're basically the same thing. Like the bombardment or like the pirate spell is an instant version of pyroclasm because your deck doesn't use colorless as much. So it was okay to that designer that some of the spells were larger in CMC because the CMC wasn't using as much colored pips.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the times, if your deck isn't a good Mana Crypt deck, the problem is almost never Mana Crypt, right?
Right.
It's almost always that you've decided not to leverage Mana Crypt, which is
Yeah.
kind of an interesting another branch on the tree of this discussion. Like, at what point is a card so good that it's worth warping your deck around it and the other versions of its effect, right? Like, if you're building a deck, don't you kind of need to build it so that it can take advantage of Mana Crypt and Mana Vault and Soul Ring and all those effects? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with this, and that's kind of why, not to like show my own deck again, but
Please
that's
do.
kind of that's kind of why I like to play Gigantha because Gigantha doesn't care about colored pips or like its color. It's 4 colorless and 1 red or 1 green. That means my deck can be constructed completely with like Mana Crypt, all the good rocks, all the good rituals like Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, like even Rite of Flame because it's like a turbo deck. Like I don't care about any of those restrictions. I can play that companion reasonably fast because I can leverage all those really powerful cards, as opposed to like playing a deck that like cares a lot more about colored pips, and I kind of have to like build my board to support that kind of play. I found a lot more success when you kind of like play into those really broken effects. Like I think a lot of people, or there's kind of like a discussion between like mana dorks versus like a talisman. Some people really like talismans, some people like dorks, and I think the how that it really plays into Mana Crypt really well and like a Soul Ring really well. That 2 CMC is like so important that like you can go turn 1 into a like rock into a talisman is super powerful versus like turn 1 into a dork and you're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think there is a bit of a a bit of a. I feel like a lot of times people act like you need to choose between dorks and rocks, and in my deck building, I tend to just play too many of both, and I found that to actually be pretty useful in a lot of decks. But in general, yeah, like if you're choosing dorks over rocks, a lot of times you're still playing a lot of rocks, and a lot of times you're still probably playing at least some dorks if you're in green. Like Birds of Paradise is just so good. It's hard for a lot of people to not run that card or Noble Hierarch also. But you do have to really think about: am I leveraging just the actual power of these cards I'm playing? If I'm not playing at least Arcane Signet or a Talisman, especially in a deck that's trying to be explosive. I feel like the ritual, like the way you describe Mana Crypt as a ritual, actually is really interesting because I feel like the format right now really wants you to be explosive. It really wants you to like have an insane start where you just play all these rocks out and play some insane value engine or drop a commander that draws you quite a bit of cards. And so Mana Crypt is super useful into that environment because the colorless is obviously being a 0-mana ritual is insane. Being a 0-mana ritual that sticks around is insane. Being a 0-mana ritual that helps you play out other rocks that often fix your colors is insane. Those are all very powerful things, and so you have to really consciously decide not to do those things. It's not just oh, I like dorks. You have to be like, oh, I like dorks, and I really have a good reason for not playing all this explosive mana, right?
Yeah, and I found that when I'm building like decks that I want to play dorks in, usually it's because I want to leverage the dork as also an additional resource, such as like if I'm playing Neoform or Eldritch Evolution, or like Gaia's Cradle and stuff like that. Like that's when I feel like dorks are really needed. Or like if I'm playing a Razaketh like line or something, like I really really need a high density of dorks just to support like the turn
Yeah,
where I have a Razaketh. Versus having like if you built your deck about around Razaketh but just have like talismans, then that Razaketh's not going to be really good.
yeah, and Spleenface was just talking on the Mind Sculptors about this, how in a Razaketh deck, a dork is like a trifecta, right? Especially a Timna Razaketh deck, because you get your mana because it's a dork, and then if your commander's Timna, you can often use it to draw cards in the late game. And then if you're on cards like Eldritch Evolution and Neoform, now you have fodder for your tutor effects. And then if you're on Razaketh, now these dorks represent win conditions on the battlefield. So obviously there are incentives to be on dorks, and that's why dorks are incredibly popular. But talismans also have this huge incentive just from the insane card quality that we have from the mana acceleration. So it's really
Yeah,
interesting. I think that really is actually, I think of the format at this point as two different archetypes. There's the red-black archetypes and the blue-green archetypes. And the blue-green archetypes, I mean, obviously there's like absent archetypes that don't fit into this totally, and there's like, Boros and things like that. But a lot of the red-black archetypes are about being hyper-explosive with rituals and like crazy card advantage spells like PETA, Necropotence, and Ad Nauseam. While there's the blue-green decks, which are based around dorks and Neoform and Thassa's Oracle and all the crazy synergies that come with like Spellseeker. And I feel like that's almost split down the divide of, am I trying to play into my talismans and my arcane signets, or am I trying to play down my Razakeths and evolutions? And do you think that's a fair way of looking at the format?
think it's really I really like how you've identified like one of the archetypes is black red, because I sometimes feel like people overvalue like blue when it's like in within those kind of strategies, when really it's like just black red that's like doing almost all the work for you. You get all your rituals, all your tutors, you get your breach, you're like good with black red. Of course having another color helps, but like that's really the core. um I was just thinking about when we were talking about this, how like sometimes people think like when you top deck that Mana Crypt like later in the game and you've got nothing to cast with it, it's kind of a shitty top deck, right? Like, or the same thing with the dork. Like if you're playing a dork deck and like you top deck your dork, and when you need something else, like it's kind of shitty. But I think when you build your deck to really leverage these kind of effects well and kind of focus on that, they could be a pretty good like top deck, or like not as bad. Like for example, like if I'm playing the black red turbo archetype, I don't really care about that top deck because I'm trying to increase my density of like really fast starts and just jamming as many of those cards as I can so my mulligan can be easier. But if I'm playing the blue green deck, even if I do top deck that dork, it's a resource I can use later. So even though it's not the most optimal top deck, it's not the worst either because it just gives me another like target for or another resource to use for Neoform or like a Razaketh or something. I think the last thing I think that's important that makes like Mana Crypt so much more powerful than all the other mana rocks is that like obviously the zero cost makes it free, but when you're like after your ad nauseam, I think like when you it's like a great chains target for you to add more mana.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. Being a ritual that is abusable to bounce spells, kind of like Dockside, right? And obviously, if you're already playing chains, you probably are already on Dockside, right? If you're in black blue, you're probably also in red, so you can probably also bounce your Dockside, bounce your chains, or bounce your Dockside, bounce your Mana Crypt, maybe bounce a Talisman to make some red mana. Who knows? But yeah, that's obviously very powerful.
Yeah, I think I've done a game before this back before Gigantha or the companion rules changed, but I've done a game where like I did turn one like land Mana Crypt and bounce my own Mana Crypt to replay Mana Crypt and play like a Petal or something, and then I cast Gigantha like that. So like the
Yeah, I think I've seen that game before. It was part of your Instagram series, right?
Yeah, so like I think that effect is also kind of important to keep in mind because all the other rocks that you get from your ad nauseum, like it's either a once effect like Lotus Petal, or they cost mana like Mana Vault. And and if you get like a really bad Nas where you don't have like a Spirit Guide or you don't have any mana remaining, you didn't hit that Mana Crypt, like hitting a Mana Vault is kind of useless in that context. Like you really need the zero rock to get there, and I think it's pretty important.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so thanks for discussing one of the most powerful cards in the history of Magic with me. I hope we were able to cover enough in this short 20 minutes or so.
Yeah,
Do you want to? Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I'm surprised by how much we actually got to like talking about it because I think like Mana Crypt is one of those like ubiquitous cards that's just so good. And it's like this auto include, you kind of figure like there's not that much to talk about it, but it's kind of interesting to get like so deep into it and like really appreciate why it's
Yeah,
so
and
powerful.
it does come up though a lot of the time where people are like, "Well, I don't own a Mana Crypt." Obviously it doesn't affect my deck that much to be not on Mana Crypt. I find that comes up a lot with budget players who maybe have never played with the card or don't have multiple copies or haven't played a certain archetype without that card before. But like I've talked to people trying to play Corvold and they're like, "Well, I don't own any cards over such a price." And it's like, well, I don't think you can play a farm deck or a deck like that's super aggressive with ad nauseam without Mana Crypt because it's so necessary to have your explosive starts after the ad nauseam or drawing 5 off the top of the Necropotence or something. You just kind of need that acceleration. Or even just a turn 1 wheel. Like, Mana Crypt plays tons of turn 1 wheels in decks like Blue Farm. And that's, like, super important. So.
Yeah, I think the it's I think some people are thinking like, well, I only hit like the turn one dream Mana Crypt like only like X amount of times out of all my games, so I can go without playing it. But I think like the point is that you having Mana Crypt in your deck gives you that opportunity to have that like amazing start of not like even if you're not playing a farm deck, like a turn one Mystic Study is so incredibly powerful. It's
Yeah.
it's like basically like when you play a turn one Mystic Remoral, but a little bit better because you don't have to pay the cumulative upkeep.
Yeah. And you hit dorks. That's kind of insane.
Yeah, there's just like so many things that one card enables you to do on turn one that I think you kind of don't you're not able to appreciate it as much until you like really start playing with it and seeing how much potential and how much like speed it gives to your deck.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Do you want to talk about any of the stuff you have coming up, Rebel, before you head off? Before we
Um,
end the show?
Not at the moment. I think I'm gonna be showing on a couple streams, but like I have a really bad memory, so I have to like
All right.
get back
We
to you
can
on that.
leave them in the description or something, or leave a link to your channel. If you enjoy, Inside Edition or something, like the drama channels or whatever, I feel like you run the best cEDH drama channel. I think that's a really bad way of describing your YouTube channel. So, how would you describe your channel, I guess?
I think my channel is like 30% useful information and 70% like inside jokes, like really inside jokes that only like 5 people would get. But I don't mind that because that's kind of the content I want to make. Like I just want to spend a
I
lot of time to make that 5 people laugh.
I love it. It's like your channel is legitimately one of my favorite channels. Every time I watch it and you shit on Sinestra, I legitimately laugh very hard. So,
I'm glad
thank you.
because I just want everyone to laugh at Sinestro with me.
Yeah. All right. Have a nice one. See you.